The Cannabis Conversation. A European perspective on the emerging legal cannabis industry.
Welcome to the Cannabis Conversation with NIAMS-USA, where we explore the new legal cannabis industry by speaking to the professionals that are helping to shape it. Hope you're all well. It's been an interesting week in cannabis in the UK. London Mayor Sadiq Khan has launched a commission to examine the effectiveness of the UK's drug laws, with a particular focus on cannabis. He was on a trip to the US to drum up business, and he visited a dispensary and a cultivation site in California whilst he was there. Predictably, the establishment didn't take kindly to this announcement. For some background, the UK government and the right-wing press really despise the mayor. I won't speculate on why that might be, but they displayed all their usual dunderhead protestations of drugs are bad, okay? Both the main parties are really stuck in the past and firmly believe in prohibition, which is not very evidence-based, sadly. I think we can be quite sure that the UK will not be at the forefront of drug reform. But on another note, I also went to the Psych conference at the National Gallery in London last week about the emerging psychedelics industry. As you all know, I am also interested in this space, quite sceptical about it. But the corporatization of it. But yes, I really enjoyed the conference, and there was a really good spread of speakers with mostly scientists and researchers talking, which was great to hear. There were quite a few familiar faces from cannabis as well, and happy to say it was more gender balanced than most cannabis conferences I go to. There was lots to glean from the conference, but a couple of takeaways that I'll share with you. Dr. Carol Routledge spoke of the fact that we've moved so quickly to sort of develop medications for indications, but we still actually really need to figure out the mechanics and the chemistry of a lot of these molecules, which is still ongoing. So she reinforced just how much there is still to learn. And also Dr. Ros Watts, who I'm a huge fan of, talked a lot about how important integration is after a psychedelic session, and integration is her kind of focus, but she kind of generally echoed what all of the researchers and doctors emphasise, which is just how important the wraparound therapy is, even more important than the actual drugs, I think. It was a really lovely talk from Cosmo Fielding, where he was interviewing his mother, Amanda Fielding, from the Becky Foundation. Everyone enjoyed that one, I think. And yes, there was the sort of spectre of corporatisation as well, with lots of investors present, and I think everyone understands the need for money, but there is a general fear that this will just become another pharma play, aggressive patents and high therapy prices supported by sort of monopolistic practices. And, in my view, I don't know if that's truly in tune with a lot of historical psychedelic usage. And hopefully we can kind of pave a better way to do things. So here's hoping. Let's see what happens. A shout out to CannaTrade, which is happening at the end of this week in Bern in Switzerland, which is a large cannabis expo, organised by the same guys as CB Club, which I went to a few weeks ago. Anyway, now on with the show. We've got a really interesting one on opioids. Enjoy. On today's show, I have Valentino Parravicini. Valentino is Chief Scientific Officer at Oxford Cannabinoid Technologies. OCT are developing licensed prescription medicines that target the endocannabinoid system to address significant unmet medical needs. And they're also one of the first medical cannabis companies to list on the standard listing of the London Stock Exchange. Valentino, welcome. How are you doing?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Anuj. I'm very well, and thank you for having me at this podcast.
Real pleasure. Real pleasure. Are you in London today?
We are, yes, I am in London. I'm in our office. I did the trip for you so that we can have a nice conversation, not disturbed by anyone at home. You'll see this all happening on YouTube, right? So hopefully this is not going to happen.
Yeah, fingers crossed my Amazon delivery doesn't turn up at the wrong time. Cool. Well, look, I am really excited about this show. Cannabis versus opioids, quite a great title. And, we've obviously heard loads about opioids in the press, so it's going to be great to dig into that. But before we do that, let's just talk a little bit about you on a personal basis, and then we'll talk a bit about OCT as well. If you wouldn't mind just introducing yourself and telling us a bit about your background and how you got into this area of work.
Yeah. So, my name is Valentino Parravicini. I'm Italian. After my degree, I work in academia for a while for the National Institute of Health in the United States. That is probably the largest and most prestigious research institution in the world. That's a federal institution for the U.S. government doing research to benefit the public. And so I continued that when I came here in the UK for the National Institute for Medical Research, that is part of the MRC. The institute now is closed down, but it moved into the Crick Institute just outside St. Pancras. So it's, again, a very prestigious institution. And I was very lucky to work with great scientists both in the US and here in the UK. I then moved to the sort of more commercial side of it, of research, working for small biotech or SMEs to be more corrected. One was cases, working in oncology, and the other one, Gamma Delta Therapeutics, was also working in oncology but with cell therapy. From there, I moved to OCT, Oxford Cannabinoid Technology, that is using an approach that is quite different from the one of the company I worked before, but not different from the large pharma company for which I work. I work also in GlaxoSmithKline here in the UK and in Roche in Italy. So we're using this type of approach here at Oxford Cannabinoid Technology to address, as you say, the unmet needs, medical unmet needs for many patients. And although that's a very nice wording, so to speak, we have to remember that those are patients that are actually suffering. And so I think OCT, what OCT is trying to do is to really try to address that and to help people feeling better.
Yeah, great. And we'll get into OCT in a second and exactly what you guys are up to. But I love your little kind of journey to OCT. What kind of attracted you to this sort of area of research effectively?
Yeah, obviously cannabinoids to be specific. So when I was working in a company, in a large pharma company, I was working in rheumatoid arthritis. And as you know, there's a lot of data out there in terms of cannabis, potentially cannabinoids to be beneficial for inflammation, autoimmunity, and rheumatoid arthritis is a big thing because it's also associated with, really serious pain. So I thought that would be a good idea. But at the time, the political environment was not correct. A big company, large pharma, being associated with cannabis was not a good thing for them, at least. And I always kept this in my sight, though. And so when the opportunity to join Oxford Cannabinoid Technology came along, and I say, okay, now there is actually the opportunity to do this seriously with a pharma approach, basically full time, and that is really something I really wanted to do. So it was a great opportunity, and I'm really happy that I joined the company.
Yeah, fantastic. I mean, that's great that you kind of had it in the back of your mind and waited,
yes,
patiently for the right thing to come up.
Yes, it was at the right time as well. You do know that there was and there is a lot of resistance to cannabis and cannabinoids. And today's cannabis versus opioid, it's quite surprising, actually, that the community and even the politicians have accepted opioid as something that is okay, considering the mayhem that's basically opium and opioid that caused in entire society, effectively, if you think at the opium war in China, right? And yet cannabis was not right for some reason. Now the times are changes, and finding myself on the cusp of, if you want, of this change and being able to use this for scientific and therapeutic reason, it's very exciting.
Yeah, and there are obviously various theories on why those things have happened, but maybe that's a topic for another show.
For another show, yeah.
But yeah, no, it's great that you're sort of zeroing on the science. And so maybe you can just introduce a bit about OCT and, what you guys are doing and what you guys are working on.
Sure. So basically, in a nutshell, OCT is developing cannabinoid-based prescription drugs to address the science and the market of pain. We use a pharmaceutical approach to cannabinoids. We are not using cannabis in our plan, not because we are against it, of course. There's a lot of evidence, and that's actually supporting our research, but because we thought, again, to use a pharmaceutical approach, we would be working with small molecule, single cannabinoids that still coming from the plants to a certain extent, and then obviously work on it and changing it to make it a better drug effectively. So, and we do know that the pharma approach to cannabinoids can be a successful story. We know about GW, the success of Epidiolex and Sativex to a certain extent, and the fact that they've been acquired by Jazz recently. So I think this approach is the right type of approach for the patient, and we try to build a company around this. So we built Research Alliance and Alliance Network, where we have R&D partnership, we have in-licensed products, we have strategic alliances, and also we create this around a strong, if you want, shareholder basis, where we have shareholders and ourselves as scientists. We have experience in big pharma. Because of this experience, we also have high compliance standard. And using all this, the science, the collaboration and alliances, and also the importance input of the shareholders, we decided to build a multiple drug programs where we will have more than one shot on goal, where we have a multiple value inflection point. So we will have upside reward, but also downside protection. And all of this is to build basically what we think is an highly potential pharma business model, where we are using integrated drug discovery to target pain, large and orphan indications, so also indications that normally are not targeted by big pharma. And that's also, as I said, because we want to benefit the people, the patients, that are neglected as well, because they suffer of some disease. They are not the large one, and they're not, the one that normally pharma and also, unfortunately, public research institution will target.
Yeah. Wow, that's great. It's fantastic. And you say that you're sort of a multi-pronged approach.
Yes.
So is it 4 candidates that you're developing at the moment?
Yes. So the multi-pronged approach is basically we are using different type of, let's call it inputs. So when we're talking about cannabinoids, you can talk about phytocannabinoids, literally as they sort of come out of plants, although we are producing them in a synthetic fashion, so we maintain a really ultra pure, high quality standard. We can use phytocannabinoid derivatives, which are basically molecule, say, drugs that look like cannabinoids. We change them to make it better as a drug, so they'll be more beneficial for the patient, effectively. And then we have also completely synthetic cannabinoids. I like to call them cannabinoid mimetic, meaning they look like cannabinoids, but the reality is that they're different from them, that they target the same biology, if you want, than cannabinoids in our body, what is called the endocannabinoid system. And these synthetic cannabinoids obviously target that system, and they have the same effects, if you want, of the phytocannabinoids in a more specific fashion. So we can, in a way, sizzle out what is wrong and what is bad and keep only the goods. At least that's our attempt, of course. And in doing so, we generate a different program. The reason why is that, and I keep saying this, it's probably people inside the company are getting sick about it, but we say we have to do the right thing for the right patient, meaning you cannot talk about pain as one big family of indication. Each patient is different. You need to use different drugs for different indication, and that's what we're trying to do here. So having a multi-pronged approach is not only allow us to diversify our input and build a better portfolio as it goes when talking about company, but also actually to target more and more indication and therefore benefit more patients.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I've covered pain a couple of times on this show, and it's so, commonly talked about. Everyone in the world suffers from some level of pain, yes. But actually the topic is so complex and nuanced in how different people interpret pain and what causes it. And yeah, it's been fascinating to look at it. And we will look at it more in the context now of the current drugs available and hopefully some of the drugs that you guys are looking at as well. So, opioids, it's been a really big topic of conversation over the last few years, and it's kind of seen as a dirty word almost now in many respects. But if we take it a step back, maybe we can just do sort of 101. Could you explain what opioids actually are and how they are used?
Yes. So the opioid, as the word will suggest, are coming from opium. That is basically the extract of the poppy seeds. As a lot of drugs out there, when I say drugs, I'm talking about medicines, they have obviously coming from a natural origin. At least originally, then they've been modified afterward with chemistry and what scientists like to do. But basically, the backbone is effectively something natural. They bind, obviously, let's say they call it receptors, so basically molecules that are in our body, and in doing so, they block a lot or change the way our body function. And obviously, they have a lot of beneficial effects when used in certain situation and for the right indication. I'll go back to that, for doing the right thing for the right patient. Unfortunately, like any other compounds or medicine or whatever that comes into our body, the effects can be too much. And when it's too much, you go from having a beneficial effect to a disastrous effect. And unfortunately, in case of some opioids, particularly the synthetic one, the line between being beneficial and being disastrous is very narrow. Now, they're used for different reasons. The one is, as you suggested, the one indication, or many indications they are used for is pain. And they are very successful in quenching some type of pain. But in general, the way they started to be used was the correct one. So the opioids were used initially to treat post-surgical pain, post-injury pain, for example, in war and so forth, or even after accident. And for a short time, so for relieving basically, for a very short period of pain, they're really, really great.
Right.
Because effectively they work. And again, from a short period, they are not very addictive compared to other drugs. For example, benzodiazepine. They're really, you can get addicted very quickly. So for this sense, they were a good drug. The problem is that although everybody knows that different type of pain should be treated in different ways, it became simple to say, well, they work fast, let's use them for other pain as well. And that where things went wrong, because they started to be used not for acute pain, like as I said, post-surgical pain or post-injury pain, but for actually chronic pain. And that's where the problem comes in.
And do you mind just briefly reminding everyone what the difference between acute and chronic pain is?
Sure. Acute means it's a very short-lived pain. As I said, the typical one is post-surgical. We all, not all, but everyone that goes in hospital basically at one point was probably given opioid of some sort. When you have a surgery, the pain can be excruciating. So when you come out, they give you opioid for a short period. They treat the pain until your body basically heals. And that should take really few days, right? That's okay. Chronic pain instead is probably the pain that more people are familiar with, is the continuous pain that is living there in the background or in the foreground, depending which pain you're talking about. Say, for example, back pain or neck pain, for example. Rheumatoid pain, where you have arthritis and your joints are not working properly. You start developing a problem, a bit of pain, and the pain goes larger and larger because basically your knee or your elbow is getting basically destroyed with time, effectively. In some cases, you need surgery for that. But so in this case, you need to take a painkiller to control the pain. The normally is not as bad and as sharp as the post-surgical pain or post-injury pain. But it can be really debilitating, particularly in a continuous. But using it for this long period is the issue with the opioid, because then you cause addiction, basically.
So that's really interesting. So we can sort of simplify it. The acute pain, there's some good evidence to show it's very effective for short periods of time. But chronic pain, i.e. something that people need to manage on a kind of longer term basis, on a day-to-day basis.
On a day-to-day basis.
Yeah. And so clearly addiction is one of the problems, the drawbacks of opioids. But if we sort of take a step back, what are the other drawbacks? So is there also an issue with the more often you use it, the more you end up having to use in order to get the same effect?
Yes, that's exactly the problem. And, addiction, it is a problem, but it stems out from this type of effect that you just say. There is a scientific name for it, so I'm not going to use it, but the bottom line is that what it happens is your body gets used to the drug. So effectively, it stops. The drug stops acting. So what you need to do is stop it over. It's like having to take in 2 coffees instead of 1 to keep you awake. And that what happens, though, that your body gets used to it. And then because you take in more and you think you need more and more, you keep taking the opioid. Some people even don't realize that the underlying problem, the pain, is already gone. But they keep taking it anyway because they think they need it. It's also a psychological factor. That's clear. But what happens is because you have to take more and more, you become addicted to it. And then you cannot stop taking it. You have, all the classic case of what happened when you have an abuse of certain drugs. And eventually you reach a situation where you're taking so much that it actually kills you. And again, in the United States, there are 15,000 people every year, and 2,300 here, more or less, here in the UK in 2020, that died because of overdose of prescribed opioids. So we're not talking about heroin. We're not talking about taking a synthetic street opioid. We're talking about prescribed drugs. Opioid, they were given to the doctor, and you're convinced that they're safe and they're working. But that effectively may lead to this disastrous effect.
Yeah. And actually, it's funny because the US is often cited as when you talk about numbers, but actually I was talking to someone in India the other day, and the numbers of people who are affected by opioids in India dwarfs what is going on in the US. So it's a truly scary number.
Yes, there is some certainly, and I'm not 100% aware of every society, but there are some social differences. But also, if you think about the sheer size of the population in India compared to the one to the United States, I mean, if you look at UK and US, obviously 15,000 is much more than 2,300, but the US is now more than 300 million people. I think 320 or so. The UK now we're just past 60 million. So the numbers more or less they almost meet. And again, historically speaking, as I said, opium had the effect that it had in society like China, for example. I mean, they fought war because of that. It's dramatic. I mean, it can really create havoc. I like to think, like, when you're thinking about medication, when you think about, the patient, it's like when you're trying to do some work at home, right? For every work, you need the right tools. So if you want to hang up, for example, a picture, you cannot use a teaspoon for the nail, but you won't use a wrecking ball either. And when it comes to pain, people think, oh, it's easy. If you have pain, and 1.5 billion people suffering of chronic pain, you can take an over-the-counter OTC drug. That's confusing with OCT, but basically an over-the-counter. Ibuprofen, paracetamol. They're cheap. They're safe. Well, first of all, we may discuss about that one as well. But that's effectively for the serious chronic pain that do not work. And then people on the other side of the spectrum, they say, well, they use opioid. But then again, it's definitely a wrecking ball because, literally wrecking lives. And it's too much. So you need to find the right hammer, if you want, the right tools. And that's what people are trying to address and what OCT is trying to address. For the indication of pain, you need the right tools. And neither over-the-counter nor opioids are the answer.
Yeah, there's huge amounts there. And just before we get on to cannabis and how cannabis comes into this, you've kind of talked a bit about it, but explaining a bit about the opioid crisis. And we could have a whole show devoted to, the bad pharmaceutical corporate practices that led to it. So I'm talking more about what are some of the things that happened. So a lot of people died. So a lot of people becoming addicted. Was that through overprescription or increasing dosage, all of these sort of things?
Yes, it is. So the problem, it's easy in a way, and I don't want to be the corporate guy here, but it's easy to blame the big pharma. The big pharma, in a way, they provide a service. And if GPs and patients, particularly GPs, should we say, when I say GPs or prescribing doctor, would stop prescribing opioids, pharma wouldn't be able to sell them. Deregulators are at fault as well. Their regulators should become, those agencies like the Food and Drug Administration in the US or the MHRA here in the UK or the EMA in Europe. All the agencies that support to look at the drugs and the medicine and make sure that what is given is safe and is actually working, it's not just on the paper but actually in the patient, should have realized earlier on that this was a disaster. Basically, it was an accident waiting to happen. And it did happen, and it kept going. And so, yes, it's easy to say the pharmaceutical companies certainly benefited a lot about this. They're cheap to produce, no doubt about that. They're relatively cheap to buy, and therefore, they do some work. They certainly, as a painkiller, certainly kill pain, but eventually, as I said, they end up killing people as well. The problem is that now people are starting realizing how bad it is. The national and supranational agencies, like for example, the European agencies or the FDA, it's quite famous, right, all over the world, the FDA, that is the Food and Drug Administration in the United States, they kept saying, okay, stop it. Do not prescribe opioid for chronic pain. And that's, fortunately, people are starting to listen. Patients are more and more aware of the problem, so hopefully that will resolve. But even here in the UK, there is a campaign, it's called Campaign to Reduce Opioid Prescribing, CROP, actually, as it goes, quite a good name. And they did some study just talking to doctors and basically asking questions about why they're prescribing opioid, for which condition, why they keep prescribing them. They actually managed to reduce dramatically the amount of opioid and other drugs as well, like antidepressant, for example. They are prescribed longer than they should be, even after effectively the problem is gone. People also unfortunately get psychologically addicted to the drugs. They think that the drugs is going to protect them, but at some point they may be able to get out of it with a certain type of lifestyle. And if the doctors and the regulators, as I said, do not address that, they do not tell people, stop, please stop, then the problem is going to continue. And fortunately now, as I said, things are starting becoming more known to everyone. There's a public outcry. You watch movies, now they're talking about it. There's a movie with Michael Keaton called Dopesick. It's actually coming out of a book. And it's a miniseries, I think, and it's addressing specifically this problem from the point of view of the doctor. I think it's quite interesting. But even, I was watching another series, and again, the big pharma company was pointed out as the big culprit in this. And, so people are start listening, and we should talk more.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, it underpins something that's a frequent topic in our show, the need for education all around in all aspects. So let's get on to the main topic, the thing that we're here to talk about. Cannabis. So how does cannabis come into this? And maybe I'll ask you that on a broad level, but also, which specific cannabinoids are people most excited about?
Sure. So how cannabis come into this? Cannabis, like our opium, it's obviously a natural product, and they both stem out of basically popular medicine. And, yes, popular medicine sometimes is not working when the problems are becoming very serious. But if a popular medical product survive for thousands of years, like cannabis, effectively, then it means there's something to it, right? It must be working. And the first sort of quote-unquote scientific evidence of using cannabis as an analgesic, in fact, as an anesthetic, effectively, during surgery, come from a Chinese surgeon more than 2,000 years ago. So just to give you an idea of how long cannabis has been around. And in fact, use of cannabis goes even more. The Egyptian, I think they were using it 5,000 years ago. But it means there is something to it. And in general, if you're looking at the different variety of indication that have been more or less tempted to be targeted by cannabis, the one that actually stands out more is pain. What happened is the cannabis per se have more than 400 different active ingredients, so to speak, or active molecule that can target our body, different part of our bodies. More frequently and more specifically, if you want, is what is called the endocannabinoid system. Any drug, not only cannabinoids, not only opium, but any drug, does something to the body because it interacts with something that's already existing in our body, right? There's already a function for it. It's useful to maintain the body working and ticking as a clockwork, really. But sometimes things goes wrong, and drugs, what they do, medicine, they readjust the broken balance, so to speak, and they put it back to normality. So you cure basically the particular disease that you have. But the molecule that you're already targeting, or the part of the body you're already targeting, they're already there, of course. So when you're talking about cannabis, what the cannabinoids do, they target what is called the endocannabinoid system. There's a series of different molecules that work together to already maintain what the scientists call homeostasis. That basically is the equilibrium, the balance of our body as it's working. And the cannabinoids can bind to this system effectively and do their work. The most popular of cannabinoids, of course, are tetrahydrocannabinol, THC, CBD, cannabidiol, cannabinol, cannabigerine, and so forth. But there are 400, and each of them work in a slightly different way, and it is known, usually it happens like that when you're looking at plants, that the effect of the overall effect of the plant is not just by one or two of them, but all the 400 together. And that's why it's a bit more difficult to use cannabis as a plant to treat certain indication, because the plants will change continuously and the effects that it has on your body is likely changing. But one important aspect of this balance of the body, where the endocannabinoids is important, a bit like the endorphin when it comes to the opioid, again, is the sensation of pain. It's how our nerves feel about an injury, whether it's real or not, and send this signal that is in a signal of alarm. Pain is a useful response of our body to tell that something is wrong and you should be careful what you do. Unfortunately, when it turns into a pathology, into the disease, the pain has no reason to be there. It's just a consequence, and that's why we need to take care of it.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great explanation, and there's so many questions I'd like to ask.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, if you're coming from a pharma approach, which is, as you say, it's difficult to study a multi-compound kind of drug effectively. Yeah. Are you zeroing in on a single cannabinoid at a time, or?
Yes and no. You can use combination of cannabinoids, and to a certain extent, that's what we do as well. With a combination, but in a way that you can control more what you're giving. So rather than 10 different compounds or 20, you give, for example, 2. Each of these 2 drug or compound will have a certain beneficial effect. And when you use them together, rather than approaching or targeting one problem in one way, you target it in 2 ways. So the chance of success is increasing, right? Mm-hmm. But you do it in a very controlled fashion. So you know exactly how much you're giving, and you know exactly how much your body's taking it, and you control it every time. The problem with the cannabis, although, of course, it's working, that's why, as I said, it lasted as a medicine, for popular medicine, is that sometimes controlling each compound is difficult. There's a lot of variability. And then, depending on different individuals, may have different effect. That is already true for a drug, for even a specific drug that is very successful in general. There is always what they call patient-to-patient variability. That means every people is different and they respond differently. But when you start changing also the drug that you're using all the time, that's what it creates a bit of complication. But certainly, as I said, and I go back to the point, cannabis, and I talk to patients actually have taken cannabis and it literally saved their lives, or certainly allow them to work and function as an individual. So it was really important. But when you're looking instead at single compounds or, again, in small number of combinations, then you can regulate that a bit better. You can control it a bit better, and therefore you can reduce what could potentially the side effects that you have when you're using a drug.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm going to be simplifying it to a crazy level, but on the previous show, when we kind of went a bit deep on pain, what was interesting, I found interesting, was the fact that, there's some very obvious things that people, even, unscientific people will know about, like anti-inflammatory properties. And as I understand, CBD is quite a lot of those. I also found quite interesting was that the THC has a kind of almost an effect on your subjective processing of pain, or almost like how you interpret it. Am I along the right lines? And are these the sort of things that you're studying?
You are. I mean, THC is a very interesting but also complex molecule, because obviously there is a sort of a more objective effect on pain. It is an analgesic, there's no doubt about it, but also because as a psychotropic effect, the way you feel the pain, and quite frankly, the reality is pain is very subjective as well. And that's why sometimes having clinical trial in pain is quite complicated, and you need to do it properly. So the concept of pain sometimes is very subjective. Some people, think that the pain is there and acceptable. Some people think that the same level of pain would be totally unbearable. And the perception of the pain per se may have an effect on how an analgesic is actually working. So a painkiller is working. But Peter, you're talking about the anti-inflammatory effect of CBD, because that's what I was getting when you said when you have a combination of different molecules that work in a slightly different way. CBD, for example, is known to have an anti-inflammatory effect. And a lot of pains, not all of them, but a lot of pains have an inflammatory component. So if you now go in with a strong analgesic that removes the pain, but you go in also with an anti-inflammatory element, compound, that remove part of this pain, at this point you have a potential winning combination. And that's what we're trying to do with one of our program, actually.
Yeah, again, I could go much deeper on this, but I'm conscious about time.
Yes.
So look, if we're talking about contrasting cannabinoids against opioids, what's interesting for you? Why do you think these are better than opioids?
Well, first of all, the safety record, if you want to talk about it.
Yes.
Just to give an idea, there are different, it depends what, people calculate things in a different way, but it's more or less accepted that in order to have a lethal dose of THC, you need to go around about 4 grams dose, right? Just to give an idea, paracetamol, normally you get 250, 500 milligram. Antibiotic, they're not really great as drug per se. Sometimes you need to take 1 gram of ampicillin, but in this case, you have to take 4 grams of THC to kill.
And that's pure THC, right? That's
the pure THC. This is pure THC. The amounts of cannabis you will have to smoke, it's heroic in order to get that one. Yeah, you probably don't have time to smoke so much cannabis. But just to give an idea. But joke aside, So that's THC. If you're looking at, for example, morphine, right? You go for 4 grams, there are 4,000 milligram to 200 milligram.
Mm.
So that's how, it's 20-fold more potent or more dangerous in this case, should we say. And then if you go to certain other type, fentanyl is another drug, has been trying to use, obviously, therapy, also unfortunately used as, for people that are addicted, 2 milligram can kill you.
Wow.
So it's 2,000 more dangerous. So the reality is we cannot simplify by saying that cannabis, THC, and CBD are not potentially dangerous. That's wrong. But what we can say that compared to opioids, are much, much more safe.
Yeah, and it's good that we start with safety, because in a clinical trial process, safety is the first bit that you look at, right?
It's the first thing you do, exactly. So when you go in human, normally, unless you're talking about people that are potentially dying for their condition, then there's no point of waiting, going to an healthy volunteer before you treat the patient. You go straight to the patient, right? But normally, if the condition is not life-threatening, then you start doing your study by showing, going to human healthy volunteer, as they say, so people sort of don't have any real disease, to prove they are safe. First, you need to prove that they're safe. You also check that your drug is going around as it's supposed to. Otherwise, there's no point of having it. But certainly prove it that it's safe. And then you go and prove that it's actually working. So for me, cannabis and cannabinoids in general are attractive because they are safe. And that's the first important thing. And then there is a strong evidence coming from thousands of years of use, as I said, from sort of popular use. And then now more and more clinical evidence that is getting better in terms of the quality on how it was collected, that they show that cannabinoids have a very good profile in safety and also in terms of treating the diseases. Pain disorders, but also other disorders, like, for example, epilepsy, and we know that, again, Epidiolex, that is effectively, it's a more sophisticated form of cannabidiol, of CBD oil, is efficacious in certain type of epilepsy. Not all of them, at least not proven for all of them, but certainly you'll see with time that it's going to show more and more efficacy also in other type of epilepsy, not just the one that's been in the market so far.
Yeah.
So that's for sure. So for me, that's why cannabinoids are interesting.
Great.
Again, it's efficacy, yes, but safety. And it's really, really important.
Yeah, that's great. And obviously, as your research, and there's obviously a number of companies looking at this, as all of this research sort of develops, we'll get a more refined understanding of what works and what doesn't. So, and where do terpenes come into the conversation, or do they come into the conversation?
They do. Obviously, terpenes are contained in cannabis, like other cannabinoids. They work in a different way, but they can stand their own as a potential medicine. For example, we know that they have some anti-inflammatory effects, but also have another effect that is basically helping, quote unquote, the cannabinoids in their, for example, analgesic effect. Some people refer to it as an entourage effect. What it means is that although you cannot measure the capability of the terpenes to do something helpful or beneficial, what this terpene can do is to help their other cannabinoids, THC or CBD, in having a better effect. Some people are contesting about this. They don't agree with the concept of entourage effect. It is a well-known effect. For example, when it comes to another plant that has been used in the past a lot, that is digitalis. Digitalis was used for supporting heart activities, right? It was known that some of the components of the plant were improving the way the active ingredient were working on the patient. And when they were getting it, when the plant was the right plant, the plant was actually working better than the single medicine. Now, obviously, the problem was, as it happened, is to have the right plant in the right amount all the time. So it's been changed. And obviously, even in the case they use the single compounds. But the concept of entourage is well known. Some people say that is not necessarily true for certainly every cannabinoid, and again, for every indication. But terpene are definitely interesting.
Yeah. That is a great way to sort of end the show. But I had a previous guest who talked a bit about the sort of just the balance of nature almost, and that the kind of primary compound that's working on the main indication, but some of the other bits in the plant are helping to break it down. Once it's served its useful purpose, it breaks it down and efficiently disposes of it, which I thought was such a kind of nice and circular way to look at it.
And also actually with the way molecules basically interact with the body, I know we need to keep it simple, but the molecules goes and bind to the cell in our body, and the terpene can actually change the way they bind effectively, and that may have a potential benefit. But I'm happy that you talk about the balance of nature. Just as an anecdote, when cannabis came to Europe early days, the ratio between the THC and the CBD in the plant was more or less 1-to-1. It contained more or less the same amount.
Very interesting.
And that was actually what it started to be used as an analgesic. And that's why in some of the drugs that you find on the market, the two have the 1-to-1 ratio. Then, of course, because of the use of cannabis for other reason, people started to increase the THC over the CBD. And now we are at a point where THC is so much higher than CBD and so concentrated in the plants that it's becoming an issue.
Yeah.
We sort of go back to the point of safety. Cannabis as sort of the traditional plant, so to speak, that is much safer than the newer plant that are coming out in the markets, because the content, in that case, the content of THC is so high that they start showing some issues. And that's what the problem.
Yes. I was lucky enough to get Dr. Ethan Russo on the show to talk about cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome, which is a function of those, endlessly this pursuit of higher THC. It's you kind of creating mutant cannabis, I think, which is obviously in chronic users is having some really bad effects as well. So again, that is another topic for another day.
I know it's on its own. And again, the plant's CBD presence, the presence of CBD is important to counteract some of the side effects of THC. Or unwanted effect of THC. So again, the nature knows better than human being again.
100%. I couldn't agree more. And a perfect way to round this out. So Valentino, thank you so much for sharing. It's such an important topic, and I loved hearing about it, and love what you guys are doing at OCT.
Thank you very much for having me. And thank you for allowing me to talk about this incredibly fascinating field, cannabinoids, and how our company is trying to use the potential to really benefit the patient.
Absolutely, and love to have you back on at some point. So yeah, the door's always open.
I'll be happy. Thank you very much.
Cheers, Valentino. Thanks for listening. Hope you enjoyed the show. If you did, please subscribe, rate, review and share the podcast. It will help me spread the good word on how this amazing industry is developing. I work with various cannabis startups to help them get funded and grow. I also work with corporates and international cannabis companies to help them understand and navigate the European cannabis sector. We're working with some great clients across the cannabis value chain, and we'd love to help you too. Please visit www.canverse.global to get in touch.